The morning fog rolled across San Francisco Bay like a gray shroud, obscuring the Golden Gate Bridge until only its towers pierced through the mist. Detective Sarah Chen stood at the edge of Pier 39, her breath forming small clouds in the October chill, as she watched the forensics team work around the body. 3 weeks had passed since the first victim appeared, and now they had their fourth. The pattern was becoming undeniable, even if the media hadn't connected the dots yet. "Same positioning as the others," medical examiner Dr. Marcus Webb said, crouching beside the victim. The man, identified as Thomas Riverside, a 42-year-old investment banker, lay with his arms crossed over his chest, a single white orchid placed in his folded hands. His expression was peaceful, almost serene, which made the scene all the more disturbing. No signs of struggle, no defensive wounds. Toxicology will confirm, but I'm betting we'll find the same paralytic agent. Sarah pulled her coat tighter against the wind. She had been with the SFPD for 15 years, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for this case. The killer they were hunting had earned the moniker the Orchid Artist from the department, though they'd managed to keep that detail from the press. Each victim was discovered in a public location at dawn, positioned like a work of art, with that distinctive white orchid as a signature. Her partner, Detective Ray Morrison, approached with 2 cups of coffee. At 61, Ray was counting down his last 18 months before retirement, and this case was testing his resolve to make it that far. Harbor Patrol says no one saw anything unusual last night. How does someone carry a full-grown man onto a busy pier without being noticed? He doesn't, Sarah replied, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. He brings them here alive, probably sedated. They walk on their own 2 feet, maybe looking like a drunk being helped by a friend. Then he positions them after the paralytic takes effect. She paused, studying the victim's peaceful face. The question is, why these 4? What connects a banker, a social worker, a restaurant owner, and a college professor? Ray pulled out his notebook, flipping through pages covered in his cramped handwriting. Different ages, different ethnicities, different neighborhoods. Riverside here lived in Pacific Heights. Professor Martinez was from the Mission District. Our social worker Jennifer Cow lived in Chinatown. And restaurant owner David Okonkwo was based in the Fillmore. Sarah's phone buzzed. Captain Michelle Torres was calling, and Sarah could already imagine the pressure building from City Hall. 4 bodies in 3 weeks meant panic was starting to spread through the city's diverse neighborhoods. "Chen here," she answered. "I need you and Morrison in my office in 30 minutes, Torres said, her voice tight with stress. "The mayor's breathing down my neck, and the Chronicle somehow got wind of the Orchid connection. We need to get ahead of this before the city loses its mind." As they drove back to the station, Sarah noticed how the city seemed different now. The usual morning bustle of commuters and tourists felt subdued, suspicious. People walked faster, looked over their shoulders more often. Fear was beginning to seep into the fabric of San Francisco's daily life. The squad room buzzed with activity when they arrived. Officers fielded calls from concerned citizens, each claiming to have seen something suspicious. The tip line had been overwhelmed since the 3rd body was discovered. Sarah made her way to the murder board she'd set up in the corner, studying the victim's photos and the timeline she'd constructed. "There's something we're missing," she muttered to Ray. "Serial killers usually have a type, a pattern that makes sense to them. These victims seem random, but they can't be. Not with this level of planning." Captain Torres's office was already crowded when they entered. The chief of police, James Crawford, stood near the window, his face grim. Beside him, FBI Special Agent Diana Foster represented the federal interest in the case. The Orchid Artist had caught the attention of the Behavioral Analysis Unit. "The mayor wants a task force," Crawford announced without preamble. FBI, SFPD, even bringing in some specialists from Los Angeles who worked the Hillside Strangler case back in the day. "Chen, your lead detective. Morrison, you're her second. Foster here will coordinate with the BAU." Agent Foster stepped forward, her crisp suit and severe expression marking her as someone who didn't tolerate incompetence. My team has been analyzing the pattern. The orchid is significant. In various cultures, white orchids symbolize purity, rebirth, and new beginnings. The positioning of the bodies suggests someone who sees themselves as an artist or a messenger. Sarah studied Foster's confident demeanor and felt a familiar knot in her stomach. Federal involvement meant more resources, but it also meant more politics and bureaucracy. "We need to re-interview everyone who knew the victims," Sarah said. "There has to be a connection we're not seeing. Maybe they all used the same service, belonged to the same gym, or visited the same coffee shop." Over the next hours, the task force took shape. Detectives were assigned to dig into each victim's life, looking for any overlap. Tech specialists began analyzing cell phone records and credit card transactions. The media liaison prepared for the inevitable press conference that would either calm the city or send it into full panic. As the sun set over San Francisco, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Sarah stood again at her murder board. 4 faces stared back at her, 4 lives cut short by someone who saw murder as art. She thought about her own family, her husband Mark and teenage daughter Emma safe in their Sunset District home. How many more families would be shattered before they caught this killer? Ray appeared beside her, jacket in hand. "Go home, Chen. Get some rest. Tomorrow we hit this fresh." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the city, the orchid artist was already selecting their next canvas. The thought sent a chill down her spine as she gathered her things. Through the window, San Francisco's lights began to twinkle in the gathering darkness, each one representing a life, a story, a potential victim. The city that she had sworn to protect suddenly felt vast and vulnerable, and she was running out of time to stop a killer who moved through it like a ghost, leaving only orchids and death in their wake. The breakthrough came at 3:47 a.m., not from sophisticated FBI profiling or advanced forensics, but from a sleepless Sarah Chen staring at credit card records spread across her kitchen table. Mark had given up trying to coax her to bed hours ago, and Emma's homework sat pushed aside to make room for the ever-growing pile of documents. There it was, hidden in plain sight. All 4 victims had made purchases at the same location within 2 weeks of their deaths. Harmony Within, a wellness center in the Richmond district that offered everything from yoga classes to meditation workshops. By dawn, Sarah and Ray sat in an unmarked car outside the modern glass building that housed Harmony Within. The morning yogis were already arriving, their rolled mats under their arms, completely unaware that they might be walking into the hunting ground of a serial killer. "Looks pretty normal," Ray observed, sipping his 3rd coffee of the morning. "Not exactly where you'd expect to find a serial killer shopping for victims." "That's exactly why it's perfect," Sarah replied, watching a young woman unlock the front doors. "People let their guard down in places like this. They're vulnerable, open, trusting. They talk about their problems, their schedules, their routines." Agent Foster met them in the lobby, having arranged for the center's cooperation without alerting the staff to the full nature of the investigation. The owner, Dr. Patricia Holloway, was a woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun, and the kind of calm demeanor that probably served her well in the wellness industry. "We're happy to help however we can," Dr. Holloway said, leading them to her office. "Though I must say I'm shocked to hear our clients have been victims of crime. We pride ourselves on being a safe space for healing and growth." Sarah pulled out photos of the 4 victims. "Can you confirm these individuals were clients here?" Dr. Holloway's face paled as she recognized each face. "Yes, they all attended our grief counseling workshop. It's a 6-week program for people who've experienced significant loss." She pulled up records on her computer. They were all in the same session that ended about a month ago. The revelation sent electricity through Sarah's spine. A grief counseling group meant vulnerability, shared trauma, and detailed personal information. "We need a list of everyone in that group, plus all staff members who had access to them." The group was led by Dr. James Ashford, Dr. Holloway said, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed. He's one of our most respected counselors. Harvard-trained, published author on grief therapy. He's been with us for 3 years. Ray and Foster exchanged glances, while Sarah continued the questioning. Is Dr. Ashford working today? He should be in around 9. He has individual sessions scheduled all morning. Dr. Holloway printed out the participant list. There were 12 people in that group. Dear God, are the others in danger? Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from the forensics lab. The paralytic agent had been identified. Succinylcholine, a drug used in hospitals during surgery. Access would be limited to medical professionals. Dr. Holloway, does Dr. Ashford have medical training beyond psychology? Actually, yes. He was an anesthesiologist before transitioning to psychology. Said he wanted to heal minds rather than just bodies. The weight of her words hung in the air as everyone processed the implications. Within an hour, the wellness center was quietly evacuated under the pretense of a gas leak, and a full investigation team descended on Dr. Ashford's office. Sarah stood in the meticulously organized space, taking in the diplomas on the walls, the carefully arranged books on grief and loss, the white orchids growing in pots on the windowsill. The sight of those flowers sent adrenaline coursing through her veins. He's not just growing them, Foster said, examining the plants. These are rare varieties. Cultivating orchids like this takes patience, dedication, and a certain obsessive attention to detail. Ray was going through Ashford's appointment book. According to this, he had a cancellation this morning, personal emergency. He's not coming in. Sarah's mind raced. They needed to find Ashford before he realized they were onto him, and more importantly, before he selected his next victim. Pull his address, vehicle registration, everything, and get protection details on the remaining group members immediately. The apartment building in Nob Hill where Ashford lived was the kind of place that whispered old money and discretion. The doorman, after seeing their badges, mentioned that Dr. Ashford had left early that morning with a suitcase, saying he had a family emergency. Sarah felt the familiar sinking feeling of a suspect potentially in the wind. Ashford's apartment was a study in contradictions, pristine and organized to an obsessive degree, yet with an underlying coldness that made Sarah's skin crawl. The walls were covered with artistic photographs of orchids, each one lit and positioned with technical precision. A locked room that the building manager had to open revealed Ashford's true obsession. Hundreds of photos of the grief counseling group members, detailed notes on their routines, their vulnerabilities, their deepest fears shared in what they thought was a safe space. Look at this, Foster called from a desk where she'd found a journal. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, documenting what Ashford called his transformation project. He wrote about selecting those who, in his disturbed mind, were ready for transcendence beyond grief. The orchid represented their rebirth, their transformation from pain to peace. He saw himself not as a killer, but as a facilitator of ultimate healing. Sarah's phone rang. It was dispatch. A man matching Ashford's description had been spotted at Ocean Beach, walking with an elderly woman from the grief counseling group, Margaret Chen, a 70-year-old widow who had lost her husband of 50 years. Sarah's heart raced as she coordinated units to converge on the beach without spooking Ashford. The drive to Ocean Beach took 15 agonizing minutes through morning traffic. Sarah's mind kept replaying the journal entries, the twisted logic of a man who believed he was helping his victims by ending their pain permanently. The fog was thick at the beach, reducing visibility to less than 50 feet. Uniforms had set up a perimeter, but finding 2 people in the mist was like searching for ghosts. Sarah and Ray moved slowly along the beach, the sound of waves crashing against the shore masking their footsteps. Then through the fog she saw them, 2 figures sitting on a bench, one leaning against the other. As they approached, weapons drawn but low, Sarah could see Margaret Chen was unconscious but breathing, her head resting on Ashford's shoulder. A white orchid lay across her lap. "Dr. Ashford!" Sarah called out, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Step away from Mrs. Chen. Ashford looked up, and Sarah saw not the wild eyes of a cornered killer, but the calm gaze of someone who believed absolutely in their mission. Detective, you don't understand. She's ready. She told me yesterday she couldn't bear another day without her Harold. I'm giving her what she wants, what they all wanted, peace. That's not your choice to make, Sarah said, inching closer while Ray circled to the right. These people came to you for help, and you betrayed their trust. No, I gave them what traditional therapy never could, Ashford replied, his hand moving to his pocket. Complete release from suffering. The next moments unfolded in slow motion. Ashford pulled out a syringe, presumably filled with the same paralytic he'd used on his other victims, but instead of using it on Margaret Chen, he raised it toward his own neck. Sarah lunged forward, knocking the syringe away as Ray tackled Ashford to the sand. The struggle was brief, Ashford's academic physique no match for two experienced detectives. As paramedics rushed to treat Margaret Chen, who was recovering from what appeared to be a heavy sedative, Sarah stood watching Ashford being led away in handcuffs. He wasn't ranting or fighting. He moved with the same calm precision he'd probably used while positioning his victims. In his mind, he was a misunderstood artist, a healer whose methods were simply too advanced for society to comprehend. The interrogation room at the Hall of Justice had witnessed countless confessions over the decades, but Dr. James Ashford's testimony would prove to be one of the most chilling in the building's history. Sarah sat across from him, the metal table between them, feeling like an insufficient barrier against the darkness that radiated from his calm demeanor. Agent Foster observed from behind the one-way mirror while Ray sat beside Sarah, his presence a grounding force against Ashford's unsettling composure. "Would you like an attorney, Dr. Ashford?" Sarah asked for the third time, following protocol even though Ashford had already waived his rights. "I don't need legal representation to speak my truth," Ashford replied, his hands folded neatly on the table. "What I did was an act of compassion, not criminality. Though I understand society isn't ready to see it that way." Sarah placed photos of the 4 victims on the table, watching Ashford's reaction. His eyes softened as he looked at each face, the way a parent might look at photographs of their children. "Tell me about Thomas Riverside," she said, tapping the banker's photo. "Thomas lost his daughter to leukemia 2 years ago," Ashford began, his voice taking on the measured tone of a lecturer. 8 years old. Sophie. He showed me her picture every session, told me how she loved butterflies and chocolate chip pancakes. He confessed that he stood on the Golden Gate Bridge 3 times, wanting to jump but couldn't because his wife needed him. But his wife had already moved on, found solace in her sister's family. Thomas was alone with his grief, drowning in it. "So you decided to kill him?" Ray's voice carried an edge of disgust he couldn't quite suppress. "I decided to complete his journey," Ashford corrected. "The orchid I placed with him, Dendrobium nobile, symbolizes wisdom and beauty. Thomas achieved both in his final moments. He understood what I was offering and accepted it with grace." Sarah felt her stomach turn, but kept her expression neutral. "How did you approach him? How did you get him to trust you enough to go with you?" "Trust was already established through our sessions. I simply reached out privately, suggested we meet for coffee to discuss some additional coping strategies. The sedative was in his drink. By the time he realized something was wrong, he was already peaceful, compliant. We walked to the pier together, him leaning on me like an old friend. Once there, I administered the succinylcholine. It's a beautiful drug, really. Complete paralysis while maintaining consciousness. They could experience their transformation fully aware, but without fear or pain. The clinical description of murder made Sarah's skin crawl. "And the others? Jennifer Cow, David Okonkwo, Maria Martinez?" Ashford spent the next 2 hours detailing each murder with the passion of an artist, describing their masterpieces. Jennifer Cow had lost her son in a car accident and spent her days helping other families while neglecting her own healing. David Okonkwo's restaurant empire couldn't fill the void left by his wife's death from cancer. Professor Maria Martinez had watched her husband waste away from ALS and confessed she felt like she died with him. They all spoke of wanting peace, of being tired of carrying their grief, Ashford explained. Traditional therapy would have had them talking in circles for years, processing and reprocessing pain that would never truly leave. I offered them a dignified exit, a transformation from suffering to serenity. Foster entered the room, placing a file on the table. Dr. Ashford, we've reviewed your history. Your own wife died by suicide 5 years ago. Is that when this started? This obsession with ending suffering? For the first time, Ashford's composure cracked slightly. His jaw tightened, and his fingers pressed harder against each other. Rebecca's death was a failure of the system. She sought help for her depression, went through therapist after therapist, medication after medication. Nothing worked. She died alone, in pain, in a hotel bathroom with a bottle of pills. There was no dignity in it, no peace. Sarah saw the opening and pressed forward. So you decided to give others what Rebecca couldn't have? A peaceful death? I decided to become the therapist I wish she had found, Ashford said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Someone who could recognize when healing meant letting go completely. The investigation over the following days revealed the full extent of Ashford's delusions. His apartment contained detailed files on dozens of grief counseling participants from various centers across the Bay Area. He had been selecting victims carefully, choosing those he deemed ready based on specific criteria he'd developed. The remaining members of the grief counseling group were placed under protective custody while prosecutors built their case. The media frenzy was immediate and overwhelming. The story of the orchid artist dominated news cycles, with talking heads debating everything from medical ethics to the state of mental health care in America. Families of the victims were thrust into the spotlight, their grief now public consumption. Sarah watched Thomas Riverside's widow on the news, tears streaming down her face as she described how her husband had been getting better, had started talking about the future again. Sarah found herself unable to sleep, replaying the interrogation in her mind. She stood in her daughter's doorway at 2 a.m., watching Emma sleep peacefully, and wondered about the thin line between healing and harm. Mark found her there and wrapped his arms around her from behind. "You saved Margaret Chen," he whispered. "You stopped him." "But I didn't save the others," Sarah replied, the weight of those 4 lives heavy on her conscience. The trial preparation consumed the next months. Sarah worked closely with the district attorney's office, preparing testimony that would convince a jury that Ashford was not insane, but a calculating killer who used his position of trust to murder vulnerable people. The defense, predictably, was preparing an insanity plea, arguing that Ashford's own grief had broken his ability to distinguish right from wrong. During this time, Sarah began attending the grief counseling group sessions that had been relocated to a different center, not as an investigator, but to understand the survivors, to help them process the additional trauma of discovering their counselor had been selecting victims from among them. She sat in circles with people who now questioned every moment of vulnerability they'd shared, wondered if they had been next on Ashford's list. Margaret Chen, the woman Sarah had saved on the beach, became an unexpected source of strength for the group. "He was wrong about me," she said during one session. "Yes, I miss my Harold every day. Yes, some days are harder than others. But I want to see my grandchildren graduate. I want to taste my daughter's terrible cooking at Sunday dinners. I want to feel the sun on my face. Grief isn't a death sentence. It's just another part of living." 3 weeks before the trial was set to begin, Sarah received a call that would change everything. Ashford had attempted suicide in his cell, using a sharpened toothbrush to open his wrists. He survived, but barely, spending weeks in the medical ward under constant supervision. When Sarah visited him, she found a different man, hollow-eyed and trembling. "I dreamed about them," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Every night they come to me, but they're not peaceful. They're angry, confused. They want to know why I didn't let them choose for themselves." Sarah leaned forward, studying the broken man before her. "Because it was never about them, was it? It was about Rebecca. It was about your guilt for not saving her." Ashford's tears came then, the first real emotion she'd seen from him since his arrest. "I became the monster I was trying to fight. I see that now. But it's too late, isn't it? They're gone because of me." The trial lasted 6 weeks. Ashford pleaded guilty to all charges, refusing the insanity defense his attorneys recommended. He was sentenced to life without parole, disappearing into the California correctional system to serve his time. The families found some measure of closure, though Sarah knew from experience that justice and healing were two very different things. 1 year after the Orchid Artist case closed, San Francisco had largely returned to its normal rhythm. The pier, where Thomas Riverside's body was found once again, bustled with tourists and street performers. Harmony Within had closed permanently. The building now housed a tech startup. But for those touched by the case, the echoes remained, rippling through their lives in unexpected ways. Sarah Chen stood before a classroom at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, guest lecturing on the psychology of medical professionals who kill. The Ashford case had become required reading for criminal psychology courses, a cautionary tale about the dangerous intersection of medical knowledge, psychological manipulation, and misguided compassion. She clicked through slides showing the crime scenes, the orchids, Ashford's journal entries. "The most dangerous killers are often those who believe they're doing good," she told the room of aspiring agents. Dr. Ashford didn't see himself as a murderer. In his mind, he was a healer, ending suffering. This delusion, combined with his medical knowledge and the trust inherent in the therapeutic relationship, created a perfect storm. A young agent raised her hand. "Detective Chen, how do we prevent this? How do we identify these individuals before they act?" Sarah paused, remembering all the hours she'd spent asking herself the same question. "We look for patterns of boundary violations, God complexes disguised as compassion, and professionals who seem too invested in their clients' decisions about life and death. But the truth is, someone like Ashford can operate for years without detection because they're often excellent at their legitimate work too." After the lecture, Sarah walked through the FBI campus with Agent Foster, who had become a close friend through the investigation. "How's Emma doing?" Foster asked. "She's decided to study criminal psychology," Sarah replied with a mix of pride and concern. "Says the Ashford case made her realize how important it is to understand why people do terrible things. Following in her mother's footsteps. God, I hope not entirely. This job, it changes you." Back in San Francisco, Ray Morrison had delayed his retirement, unable to leave the force with the Ashford case as his final major investigation. He now led a task force focused on protecting vulnerable populations from predatory professionals. His office wall featured photos of Ashford's victims alongside new policies implemented at counseling centers citywide, mandatory reporting systems, peer review processes, and regular psychological evaluations for therapists dealing with grief and trauma. He was reviewing files when Officer Patricia Yamamoto, a recent Academy graduate, knocked on his door. "Detective Morrison, we might have a problem. There's been a complaint about a therapist at an addiction treatment center in the Tenderloin. Patients are saying he's been suggesting that some people are too broken to fix." Ray felt the familiar chill run down his spine. "Get me everything on this therapist. Employment history, educational background, any complaints or commendations, and pull the records of any patients who've died or gone missing from that center in the last year." The investigation that followed proved to be a false alarm. The therapist guilty of poor phrasing and burnout rather than homicidal ideology. But the vigilance it represented had become part of the city's institutional memory. The Orchid Artist had taught them that predators could hide behind certificates and compassion. Margaret Chen, The survivor Sarah had saved on the beach had become an advocate for patient rights in therapeutic settings. She traveled to medical conferences and therapy centers, sharing her story and pushing for stronger oversight. Her presentation always included a photo of her with her grief counseling group, taken weeks before Ashford began his killing spree. "We trusted him with our deepest pain," she would say, her voice strong despite her age. "He saw our vulnerability not as something to protect, but as an opportunity to exploit. No one should have the power to decide when another person's life should end, no matter how much pain they're in. That choice belongs to the individual alone, made with clear mind and full information, not manipulated by someone who thinks they know better." In San Quentin State Prison, James Ashford spent his days in protective custody, his former profession making him a target among the general population. He worked in the prison library, organizing medical texts and occasionally tutoring inmates working on their GEDs. Letters from the families of his victims arrived regularly, some filled with rage, others with questions he could never adequately answer. He corresponded with a forensic psychiatrist studying medical serial killers, providing insights into his mindset during the murders. "I believed I was special," he wrote in one letter, "that my understanding of suffering gave me the right to end it. It's a seductive delusion for those of us in helping professions. We see pain every day, and the temptation to provide a permanent solution can overwhelm our ethical training. I crossed a line that should never be crossed, and I wake up every day knowing I destroyed families while believing I was saving them." Sarah returned to San Francisco after her FBI lecture series, walking through the Richmond district on a foggy evening. She stopped outside the building that had housed Harmony Within, looking up at the windows, now glowing with the blue light of computer screens. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mark. "Dinner's ready. Emma made your favorite." As she walked home, Sarah passed an elderly man sitting on a bench, feeding pigeons. For a moment, her mind flashed to that foggy morning on Ocean Beach, to Ashford sitting with Margaret Chen. The man looked up and smiled, and Sarah nodded back, continuing her walk. The city had healed as cities do, absorbing trauma into its history and moving forward. But in her apartment that night, after Emma had gone to bed and Mark was watching television, Sarah stood at her window, looking out at the city lights. She thought about the 4 victims, their faces permanently etched in her memory. Thomas Riverside, who might have found new purpose. Jennifer Cow, who was starting to date again. David Okonkwo, who had just opened a foundation in his wife's memory. Maria Martinez, who had enrolled in a writing workshop the week before she died. The orchid artist case had taught her that evil often wore the mask of kindness, that the most dangerous predators were those who believed in their own righteousness. It had also shown her the resilience of survivors, the importance of vigilance, and the complex nature of justice. Ashford would spend the rest of his life in prison, but his victims were gone forever, their potential futures erased by someone who thought he knew better than they did about their own lives. Sarah's phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. It was dispatch. There had been a murder in Golden Gate Park, unusual circumstances. They needed her expertise. She looked back at her family, safe in their home, then grabbed her badge and gun. The city needed her, and she had sworn to protect it, to stand between the predators and the vulnerable, to ensure that no one else would fall victim to those who confused control with compassion. As she drove through the San Francisco night, the fog rolling in from the bay, Sarah Chen carried with her the lessons of the orchid artist case. Every investigation was a chance to save someone, to prevent another family from experiencing the devastating loss she'd witnessed. The work was hard, often heartbreaking, but necessary. In a city of beauty and darkness, of innovation and vulnerability, she stood as a guardian, forever changed by a case that had shown her the depths of human delusion and the strength of human survival. The orchids still grew wild in parts of Golden Gate Park, their white petals catching moonlight on clear nights. They were just flowers now, their symbolism reclaimed from a killer's twisted narrative. Beauty, rebirth, and new beginnings meant something different to each person who saw them. And in that difference, in that individual interpretation and choice, lay the freedom that Ashford had tried to steal. San Francisco endured. Its people continued to trust and love and grieve in their own ways, and life, complex and painful and beautiful, went on.